Being someone that has loved fantasy for a very long time has been a very rewarding experience. And since getting back into reading, I've tried to make it my life goal to understand everything going on in the fantasy realm. But there have been two series in fantasy that I've had a really hard time explaining from the outside. Those series are the Malazan Book of the Fallen series and also a series that's called Cradle. Of all of the fantasy series that I see talked about around the book sphere, these series have some of the most dedicated, hardcore fan bases of any other series that I've ever seen or read. But from the outside, I have had a hard time understanding exactly what is Cradle, what is Malazan. Both of them seem to be tackling a scope unlike any other fantasy series. Both of them seem to be tackling the fantasy genre in a way unlike other series in this medium, but I have finally decided to rectify this hole in my knowledge. What the heck is Cradle?
I've never seen someone as passionate for anime as people are for Cradle. But what exactly is it? I'm going to take the plunge and finally figure out exactly.
What is Cradle? So I think the best first place to start when we're talking about the Cradle series is to understand the term shonen manga. Shonen manga is a specific genre of manga, which is those Japanese comics you often see in the weird section of the bookstores, that is specifically marketed at young adult males. I don't point this out to make fun of the genre, but it really does help us understand some of the elements that we're going to be seeing inside Cradle, as it is basically just the book version of a shonen manga or anime. While the common themes in the genre are specifically built to appeal to teenage boys, I think the trappings and goals of this genre, while there are some limitations and I think there are some inherent drawbacks to things that can be difficult to overcome, I think the style of story allows for a level of escalation so far beyond what we normally read in book fantasy or epic fantasy, which is what I usually partake in, and I really think that's what Cradle is going for, and we will see if it succeeds or not. According to Wikipedia, some of the most popular shonen manga titles include Dragon Ball, One Piece, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Naruto, Bleach, Hunter x Hunter. I've seen Attack on Titan included in lists like these. And if you want an American point of comparison, I would say the easiest one is Avatar: The Last Airbender. Many commonalities within these series would be one of a young teenage male protagonist who sometimes is very talented, but often he's the regular guy who wants to be able to save people or accomplish some big goal, but he's not very powerful and he has to acquire that power over the course of the series. We see common themes of mixing martial arts with science fiction, with mythological creatures, and also like melee weapons, but also sometimes guns. The television show, or at least what I've seen of it for Dragon Ball Z, was probably my closest comparison for what we actually saw in Cradle, at least in book one, which is what we're going to be talking about here today. Now that I've made those comparisons, if you're familiar with them, you probably already know what Cradle is going to basically be. But if you're unfamiliar with the genre of media, let's just talk about Cradle specifically. The story of Cradle is primarily the story of a young boy named Lyndon who grows up in a vaguely Eastern society that focuses on martial arts and their ability to connect with different types of magic that are mostly powered by the world's soul type energy. Through Lyndon's eyes, you are sort of exposed to the different types of elemental energy and the different sort of classes of magic users that there are in the world. And in the story, normally when children are young, they are assigned to one of these classes by having the magic choose them or show some sort of natural affinity towards one of the classes. We find an immediate element of relatability to the main character, Lyndon, in that he is unsouled, which is he has no natural affinity towards any of these classes. So through his eyes, we get to experience what it's like to be more normal in a world of superpowered people. All Lyndon wants to do is rise through the classes that exist in his society, but because he is deemed unsouled and he doesn't have an affinity towards one of these types of magic, he is a second-class member of society and he's basically treated as the useless elephant in the room in every single situation. And we experience that firsthand as time after time, he's basically ignored or overlooked or looked down upon. And in an honor-based, class-based society built around having more power, Lyndon has none of it. So his initial goal is to try to acquire more power. As I mentioned before, this is a common theme in the genre, and if I compare it to Dragon Ball Z, it's sort of the way that Dragon Ball Z works, which is there becomes a problem, the main character in Dragon Ball Z has to get more power to overcome that problem, and after he does that, he becomes familiar with another problem with more power. Cradle seems to be following that line of thinking. And similar to something like Dragon Ball Z, we quickly become aware that things can become a lot more powerful than the main character initially assumes. In a lot of the modern fantasy that we read today, and the fantasy that I generally talk about, there are usually hard magic systems with very specific caps on how powerful people can become. And in stories like Mistborn, one of the challenges is finding ways to use those powers in creative ways that allow them to become more powerful than their enemies or outsmart their enemies using that power. Something that I've noticed with my limited experience with shonen is they don't have a cap, and that seems to be pretty common. We are 4 books into the Stormlight Archive series, and we've had multiple Mistborn series, and usually what we get is normal superhero, regular superhero type power. Characters can fight really well, they can throw fireballs, they can sometimes maybe fly. Flying allows one to travel quickly or scale a mountain easily. But in shonen series, often the power escalation happens on a much faster power curve, where instead of just throwing fireballs and taking out 10 enemies, characters can eventually get the power to like leap between planets and destroy whole civilizations by snapping their fingers. Like, we're talking like things get super powerful super quickly, and the scale is off the chain. While the primary A plot of Unsouled is about Lyndon and his sort of coming of age, pretty quickly, even in this book, we are shown that this series is going the traditional shonen route of just turning everything up to 11. This is a sweet promise for a franchise that is going to be epic on a scale unlike others that you normally read in epic fantasy, but it also comes with some drawbacks, and I'm curious to see how Cradle will handle those difficulties as the series progresses. As you might expect in a series where characters can become very, very powerful, you might wonder how that affects the character development in a story like this, and I think that is one of the difficulties that I need to see Cradle overcome for it to become one of my favorite series. Namely, as the character goes through his journey, the escalation of power seems to make things that you spend time with in the early goings seem to have less significance than you might want normally from a story. For comparison, in like Brandon Sanderson's Way of Kings, you spend a very long time with Kaladin, getting to know Kaladin, his internal struggles, the state of the world, and when he gets power in the increments that he gets power, it's a big deal because it affects all of these things in this local context that you start to know. And of course, the story does expand over time. But if you ramp up the speed of that story, it becomes difficult to care about a lot of the elements that are happening, because when you spend a first chunk of a book having characters go from level 1 to level 2, but then you see someone at level 2000.
Vegeta, what does the scouter say about his power level? It's over 9,000!
Sometimes knowing what parts you should care about and whether or not it seems like you wasted part of your time on getting world development that's not going to matter in the long run because you're going to start getting a bird's eye view of everything, it can be difficult. The plus side of that is that the story is always moving at a pretty quick pace. I do think it starts off maybe a little bit slow, but once the story gets going, you are moving extremely fast, and the book isn't very long, so it goes by quickly. And it can be difficult when you're in a short book where everything moves by quickly and things are advancing very fast to, one, understand what's going on, but I sort of enjoy being in the dark a little bit. I like the mystery, but when we do spend time actually getting exposition about some of the local cultures, it starts to feel like maybe that's not that relevant in the grand scheme of the plot, which is sort of a catch-22. If you know the story is going to escalate to this massive level, you want to see how you get there, so you want the plot to move quickly, but if the plot moves so quickly that you don't feel really connected to the characters or any of the cultures that you're learning about, that's the struggle. I've spoken to a few Cradle fans, and it seems like the nature of this story starts to sort of come to its own maybe after book 3. I'm currently reading book 2. But in book 1 of Cradle, Unsouled, the struggle is real. It's fast-paced, there's a lot of really awesome elements thrown in there, but you don't know what to care about and you don't know how much is relevant, and also you're in the dark about a lot of it, and there is a second main plot that is super awesome and really interesting, but you only get tidbits of it when flipping back and forth between the main character and this other crazy plot. But because you know that other crazy plot is out there, you know the heights that this series could reach, and you get a glimpse of the scale and how awesome this series could be, and that's how I feel about Cradle after reading book 1. Cradle has been called progression fantasy, which includes the idea of characters constantly becoming more powerful or finding more powerful items that allow them to be able to overcome the challenges, and then as they get stronger, the enemies they have to fight and the problems they have to overcome also get harder and stronger. And in theory, the more time we spend with the series, the more fleshed out and developed all of these elements become until it becomes the massive, awesome, epic series that everyone is talking about. I have high hopes. The story hooks are there. But in a lot of ways, Unsouled, as the first book in Cradle, does feel like it's making a lot of promises that you're not sure if it can keep, and the story is sort of broken up into almost episodic elements, which fits the manga and anime sort of style that it's going for. But the promises that it's making are super interesting, and based on the fan base and the passion of the fan base, I think it's probably going to deliver. And because the books are incredibly fast-paced and relatively short, I think it's something that I'm going to have a blast blasting through. This first book leaves me with a lot of questions I'm dying to have answered, and I fully expect them to be answered. But as a first entry, it can be a little bit of a mixed bag. But thankfully, the books go by quickly, and I don't have to wait very long to see what's going on. Another nice element of the Cradle series is so far, you haven't had any of the weird anime moments where you have a pervy old man staring at a relatively young person's chest in creepy, pervy ways.
Let me have a look.
See?
That could come later in the series, I hope not. Nevertheless, have you heard about Cradle? Are you interested in Cradle the series? If you've read it, can you tell me if the promises that are offered in this first book are fulfilled? I really assume so, because it seems like everybody that's read Cradle is pretty into Cradle by at least book 4. Regardless, I'm planning on continuing on with this series and finding out for myself. If you like this video, please remember to smash that like button, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're interested in Cradle, I hope to bring you more Cradle content in the very near future as I continue to read through the series. For me, the easiest comparison with Cradle was Dragon Ball Z, but if you have a better comparison for what Cradle is like in the anime world, let me know in the comments down below. If you'd like to talk about Cradle more specifically, I have Cradle channels in the Discord, which is linked down below. Anybody can join it, and I would love to talk about Cradle with you there. Hey, get me hyped up to continue along with the series. Anyway, I hope to see you again soon in the next video. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, be excellent to each other.
Sleep, no one ever get enough. Always looking out tired. Sleep, no one ever get enough. If I don't show up, I might get fired. Sleep, no one ever get enough. Always looking out tired. Sleep, no one ever get enough. If I don't show up, I might get fired.